Hello, my name is Brian Lewis and I'm an instructor with JTNS. Today we're going to talk about right to know, hazard communication, and globally harmonized system. So as we begin this, what I'm going to do is ask you all to pause the video for a brief moment and discuss any near misses, close calls, accidents you have, and what was critical to those near misses, close calls, or actual accidents, and then discuss how you might prevent them from occurring in the future. As soon as you are finished with that discussion, please press play and we will just go ahead and continue the presentation. So go ahead and press pause and press play when you're ready to continue. Hopefully you had a fruitful discussion, and we'll continue with our presentation on right to know, hazard communication, and global harmonized systems. GHS is now in place. It's been in place since 2015, so we need to keep that in mind. Material safety data sheets should no longer be in the workplace. We should have safety data sheets, and so you can have those electronically, you can have those physically. A lot of places have both in case of some kind of power failure. But if you've been doing this as long as I have, I still mess up once in a while, and I still use material safety data sheet or MSDS when I should be saying safety data sheet. So we all need to work on saying safety data sheets and safety data sheets and SDS. So keep those in mind. So why did OSHA align the hazard communication standard with the global harmonized system? Well, we got to have a common, coherent approach to communicating hazardous chemicals to people. And chemicals are produced all over the United States, all over the world, in Europe, Asia, the Middle East, everywhere. And there are language barriers. Let's be honest with ourselves. There are language barriers for people, and we need to overcome those barriers. So the pictograms that we'll talk about later on labels do a wonderful job of overcoming those language barriers. So that's important. We have a specific criteria for labels, and we have harmonized format for safety data sheets. So there is a 16 section safety data sheet that manufacturers and distributors of hazardous chemicals need to comply with, and that's a good thing. Before, we did not have a standardized format, and it's important to have a harmonized, standardized format across the world for these hazardous chemicals. So the benefits, well, we've got quality, we've got consistency from the manufacturers to the distributors to the end users. We're going to reduce confusion. We'll have good, easily obtainable information as far as what the hazards are. It helps with risk management. It helps with training. There's a whole bunch of things that really helps. It really helps a lot. Some notable features, we use now a specification approach rather than a performance-oriented approach, a hazard classification instead of a hazard determination approach. Now, these sound a lot of like safety and health geek speak, but as we go forward, you will see to be specific about what you need to provide is better than, hey, you have to provide the right stuff, whatever that may be. A hazard classification, is it a physical hazard? Is it a health hazard? What type of hazard it is, that's important. Keep that in mind. As you see up here, some things that are now required and are a little bit better well defined are the product identifier. Now, what is a product identifier? That is simply the name. That is simply the name of the chemical that you are looking at using. A pictogram that gives you a real nice and very straightforward idea of the hazards of the chemical you're using. A signal word, which is either hazardous or dangerous, and those things give you an idea of both how intense and quick the hazard comes upon, And so the less dangerous, I hate to use that word, but the less violent or the less harsh reaction would be a hazardous. Not that it's easy, not that there is no hazard, but less hazardous. Dangerous is a more immediate, more intense reaction with the chemical. So that signal word along with the pictogram gives you a great deal of information right off the bat. Hazard statements, precautionary statements, and lastly a way to contact the manufacturer, the distributor of the chemical that's you can reach in case you need to get some information. Safety data sheet, we've already talked about that. That's the new information that we have, or the new terminology we have, and has a 16-section format. The guidance, decision logic criteria has been removed. It streamlines a lot of stuff, and it may be provided as a separate document to help compliance at a later date. So, organization of the final rule. You'll notice that we have the purpose of the rule, the scope and application. We'll have definitions, hazard classifications, written HAZCOM program, labels, other forms of warning, safety data sheets, employee information training, trade secrets, and of course the effective dates when all this stuff must be in place, which have all passed really. So you have all these appendices, A, B, C, D, E, and F, that give guidance, that talk about things that are mandatory and how to approach things like trade secrets, physical hazard criteria, as well as the health hazard criteria. All that's really important. It's really important is when we talk about training that you are trained before you are required to use or come in contact with hazardous chemicals. It's also important that the information in the training be at the time of their initial assignment, just like I said, and whenever a new hazard is introduced. So we bring a new chemical into the workplace, at that point in time we need to have training on that new chemical. Also, annual refresher needs to be conducted to reinforce what we have already learned and what we've already been exposed to as far as information. We need to know these things, we need to work at remembering them, and do not discount hazardous chemicals. There are immediate consequences for exposure or overexposure. There's also long-term consequences for overexposure, long-term consequences for repeated exposure. It's really important that we realize. A lot of times we look at the here and the now and we forget about what life is going to be like 20, 30 years from now. From repeated overexposure to some of these hazardous chemicals. We want to talk about the label elements. We want to make sure we understand the information that's on there and how people might use that information to protect ourselves. Once again, the product identifier or the name, signal word, hazard statements, pictograms, precautionary statements, and how we make contact with the people who either manufactured or distributed this chemical. A general understanding of how these labels interact. We also want to talk about the format and what that means in that information that we can get in those various sections. Physical hazard is broken down, and health hazard is broken down into sub-classes. So when you look at a safety data sheet, you'll see physical hazards listed there, and they'll talk about, are they explosive, are they flammable, as well as other things. Health hazards, is it a carcinogen, does it cause eye irritation, does it cause skin irritation? All these classes, whether it's a physical hazard or a health hazard, those two main classifications of hazards are further broken down so that you can see what exactly they're trying to tell you. So that's important. Manufacturers are still responsible for determining all these hazards. The classifications are based on a full range of information, and there's all kinds of procedures in place for properly filling out, properly creating a safety data sheet and providing correct information. Here's an example of health hazards. As you can see, acute toxicity, and it has basically acute toxicity is poison. It's a health hazard, and then you can see the hazard category, it talks about those things as far as how harsh it is. Skin irritation, carcinogenity, reproductive toxicity, whether you're male or female. If you're interested in having children, healthy children, you want to pay attention to that. The STOT, or specific target organ toxicity, for a single exposure or a repeated exposure. I like to point this out. STOT, specific target organ toxicity. That can be for a single exposure or repeated exposure over time. These are all important things that we need to know when we look at and talk about health hazards. Physical hazards, once again, it is broken down in subcategories where we can talk about explosive, flammables, whether they're gases, whether they're aerosols, oxidizers. All these things are important that we pay attention to and that we take into consideration. Hazards not otherwise classified. This is section 16 on the safety data sheet. And basically, hundreds, if not thousands, of new chemicals are created every year, and there's always the potential that somebody's going to come up with something that we've not seen or heard of before, a brand new animal, so to speak. So we want to make sure that we have something in place in case somebody does come up with something like that. And so if somebody comes up that creates a new hazard, we want to put it here in this section, and we will make sure people know about it. So the approach to labels, the final rule is a specific approach to labels. You can find it in Appendix C. It's a cookbook on how to do labels and how to make sure that they're appropriate. So we want to make sure, if you're a manufacturer or distributor, that you're doing that correctly, right? Label requirements, once again, we want to make sure that people know what the product identifier is. Make sure they know the signal word, the hazard statements, the pictograms, precautionary statements. All of that is important, as well as how to contact somebody. As you can see here, this first one, a health hazard that has the star-shaped shape on a person's chest, is carcinogen, mutagen, has reproductive toxicity, as well as respiratory toxicity. The flame pictogram obviously depicts something that's a flammable, that burns, that's self-igniting. The exclamation mark is an irritant, maybe eyes or skin or both. Also could be a skin sensitizer and is used also to show acute toxicity. Gas cylinder means a gas under pressure. Corrosives, these are things that burn and cause eye damage, metal, skin, that sort of thing. Exploding bomb means explosive. This last one, or not last one, but the one in the lower left-hand corner, the flame over a circle, denotes an oxidizer. Oxidizers are chemicals that in certain conditions produce oxygen, and because of that, they can make the fire burn hotter, be more intense, and even make it grow. So we want to pay attention to things like that. The environmental pictogram shows a dead tree and a dead fish. If you like fishing, if you like hunting, if you like going on hiking and enjoying camping and things like that in the nature, you want to pay attention to this one. It's important. It's important that we keep all of our common parks and recreational spaces good for everybody to use. Of course, the skull and crossbones, that very last one, means acute toxicity. What is acute toxicity? Acute toxicity is basically a poison. It means it kills you pretty quick. It's not something that you have to worry about long-term effects. It's something you have to worry about short-term effects. Short-term, and acute, meaning short-term, gets you bad, and it gets you quick. So we want to make sure we cover that. Now, OSHA really wants the red box on point to be red. They want that border to be red, and it makes sense. They feel like, and I think it's appropriate, that red pulls your eyes into the pictogram and what they're trying to tell you there. So if you're going to make copies, make sure you use a color copier. If you're going to print safety data sheets off the internet, make sure you're using a color printer. This is important. It's important that we make these labels and these safety data sheets as information rich as possible. So updating the labels, OSHA requires the labels to be updated within 6 months of getting new and significant information. Hopefully the manufacturer, the distributor will send you those labels. Usually they send them along with the safety data sheets in new shipments. So these things are living documents, so to speak, in that they're always being updated. So when you receive a new shipment of a chemical, it may have a new label on it, may have a new safety data sheet. Someone's going to have to investigate this and remove the old and replace it with the current. You still want to hold on to the old safety data sheets, but if you're looking to organize things in a quick and efficient manner, you want the most current safety data sheet with the most current chemical available to employees and everybody in the facility. That's important. A label example. Well, you've got the name or the identifier up there, then you have the pictograms, and then you have warning or danger. So that's important. Flammable liquid, etc., etc. You see where they talk about specific target organ toxicity there, and both short-term and long-term. That's really important that we pay attention to that. And as we go further down the label, we get more and more specific information. But as you can see from the label, right off the bat, you have the name of the chemical, you have a visual representation of what the hazards are of this chemical, and then you have a one-word statement, then you have short statements, and then longer statements, and lastly what you have is contact information, and that's really important. Workplace labeling. OSHA says you can use your own workplace specific labeling system as long as they provide all the information that they've required. That's important. You have to be updated to make sure the information is consistent, and most people are not going to do this, though. Most people are going to use the labels provided by the manufacturers and the distributors, because unless you're a chemical manufacturing company or facility yourself, it's not really so efficient to do that. Here we have the 16th section safety data sheet, and as you'll notice, you've got the name of the substance, the hazards identified in section 2, if there's more than one component to it, what's in it, first aid measures in section 4, how you treat people that have been exposed to it. If you're trying to fight the fire, that's what you're going to find out what to do in section 5. Accidental release, how do you gather up the material that has been accidentally released. Handling and storage, there again, if it's an oxidizer, you don't want to store that with flammable or combustible materials. So how you handle it, where you store it, is all important. Exposure controls, PPE, this is where you're going to have things like, hey, you need to have gloves, you need to have a face guard, you need to have goggles, you need to have maybe an eye wash and a safety shower present. Physical and chemical properties are an important section in section 9. If it's a liquid, is it heavier than water or is it lighter than water? If it is a gas or vapor, is it heavier than air or is it lighter than air? All of this information is important because what it does is it tells you what to expect if this chemical is released or it's being used. Is it going to be in the top or the bottom? And it's important to know this stuff. Stability and reactivity is also important to know, as well as section 11, where it has toxicological information there. So when we talk about toxicological information, one that's normally there is LD50 number or an LD100 number or both. What do those numbers mean? Well, typically what they are is the lethal dose it takes to kill 50% of a population, or the lethal dose it takes to kill 100% of the population. Now this is important. They do studies with animals, and this number is usually given in ounces per pound, ounces of the substance to be consumed by the weight or per pound of the animal or the person that's consuming it. So That's important to know. It's important to know if you give so many ounces to a 100-pound man, what are the chances it's going to kill him? Or a 100-pound woman, or 200-pound woman, or 150-pound woman, or 130-pound man, or whatever your weight is. You have to do a little bit of calculation there. So that toxicological information, it's really important. We want to know the dose that we can avoid, right? So that we can avoid. We don't want to be exposed if it's at all possible. Section 16 has a lot of information there. If there's anything, hazards that have not been addressed already, this is where you can find it. So 12, 13, 14, and 15 are non-mandatory. They're ecological, disposal, transport, and regulatory information that's available for other entities that have to deal with transportation, the ecology, and disposal. So for employers, you have to have initial training with employees. You need to talk about the elements on the labels. You have to have training on the new safety data sheet format. You have to maintain and update the safety data sheets as new safety data sheets and labels are introduced into the workplace. We have to review the current hazard communication program and update it as necessary. For manufacturers, they have to bear the cost of startup and reclassification, producing new labels, producing new safety data sheets that are going to be used to train everyone else. That's important. Guidance and outreach. OSHA has developed a lot of materials. There's quick cards, OSHA briefs, booklets, small compliance guides. There's technical materials if you want to do some model training, if you want to prepare a safety data sheet, if you want to know how to classify the hazards. There's all kinds of web applications, safety data sheets, and electronic forms, things to help you produce safety data sheets, as well as have a calculator for acute toxicity or how poisonous something is. That's really important that you address that. There's all kinds of web pages that are available. You can go to OSHA.gov, and if you don't want to memorize this long web page, and use the search function on the federal OSHA web page and find all kinds of information. I hope that you have learned something about safety data sheets, about the new GHS and labels. Hope that this has reminded you how important it is that we know what the chemicals we use are. Not only that we know, not only is it important to know what chemicals we use, but how hazardous they are and how to protect ourselves so that we're not exposed and not overexposed especially. Thanks for paying attention. Have a great day. And as always, if you have any questions, please contact the JTNS instructor through the safety person at your facility. We will answer all the questions that we get. And if we don't know the answer right off the top of our head, we will definitely look it up and make sure that we give you a good answer. Thank you all. Have a great day.